His full name was pronounced Itzhac Bentov, but to most people he was known simply as Ben. Ben would usually start his talks by saying, "Now we will talk about all there is, from atom to cosmos, from humanhood to godhood, no less." And he would talk about the nature of reality and our place in it, and his own model of the universe, and his personal experiences in expanded states of consciousness. And finally, at the end, the ultimate question: who runs the show? Ben had a tremendous sense of humor and a capacity to explain very complex ideas in a very simple and understandable way. And he illustrated his 2 books with his own cartoon-like drawings. Niels Bohr has said, "Some things are so serious that one can only laugh about them." Ben called himself a nuts and bolts man, a plumber. He was trained as a mechanical engineer, and somewhere along the way, he started meditating and his consciousness opened up, so that reality began to be perceived by him in 2 ways, 2 kinds of knowledge: the linear, scientific, objective knowledge, and the direct, intuitive, inner knowledge of a mystic. And the combination of these 2 gave him a unique and a very unusual perspective on the nature of reality. First of all, he saw reality as a hologram. It's a totality in which every part is related to every other part, and they're all interdependent. And this hologram he perceived as vibratory in nature. In other words, as he said, it's an off and on reality, and we are only part-time here. It's an oscillating field. And it may appear to us as a continuous reality, whereas in fact, it's like a film composed of separate frames. He looked at reality as a whole as consciousness itself. Consciousness in the state of evolution, of unfolding itself to know itself. And there is nothing outside it. So that the physical reality, the manifest world, is only another expression of that reality, which is consciousness or existence itself, aware of itself. And matter is then another expression of consciousness at different levels of evolution, so that one can look at reality as being composed of an innumerable number of levels of reality, each level having its corresponding level of consciousness. And reality is perceived by those who are experiencing it only on the level of their own evolution of the nervous system. The mechanism in the physical body that perceives reality is the nervous system itself. And so, as a biomedical engineer, this is what Ben specialized in, he became interested in studying the effects of changes in consciousness on physiology. And I must say that Ben, whenever he talked about these matters, never claimed this to be any sort of ultimate teaching. He spoke about this as a working model. And he would say, "I speak from my present level of ignorance, because ignorance grows exponentially. The more questions you ask and the more answers you get, the more questions there are to ask. So it's an unending process of unfoldment of consciousness." And Ben saw reality, or I should say, reality unfolded itself to him in the form of structure, because he dealt with mechanisms. To someone else with another background, reality would reveal itself in terms of, let's say, poetic metaphor or vibrations of different sounds to a musician, so that we all are like snowflakes, all similar, yet all different. And the subtitles of his two books actually indicate that reality appeared to him in terms of structure, because the subtitles are on the mechanics of consciousness and on the mechanics of creation. So Ben has designed instruments to study these physiological changes that occur in the body when a certain energy rises through the spine. In the East, it's called Kundalini, or coiled serpent. It rises up the spine and awakens certain energies in the body, which allow perception to become broader, and the brain functions then on a different level. He called it his model of Kundalini. Ben looked at reality as being driven by the force of evolution to infinity as consciousness unfolds itself. So in this graph, this arrow would represent the energy of evolution. And the bell curve, so-called, is a method to show graphically statistical data. And if the peak of this curve represents the average level of consciousness of humanity now, and the lower end of it shows the lowest level of consciousness, let's say the mafia types, as he used to put it, then the cutting edge here, the highest edge, would be individuals such as Einstein or Leonardo da Vinci. Now, as evolution pushes this ahead, some years from now, this bell curve will assume this position. So what will happen? That the average consciousness will be where the advanced consciousness is today. The low level will be where the average is today. And the high consciousness of humanity at that time will be something that we can hardly imagine. Because as he used to say, the potential of the human nervous system is enormous. And we really don't know where it's taking us, from humanhood to godhood. And this chart shows an experiment that he did with a subject sitting on a chair that had a device attached to it called ballistograph. And the ballistograph is something that picks up micro vibrations of the body. So the large curve that you see reflects the motion up and down of the subject as the breathing occurs. And then the small wiggly lines superimposed on that indicate the heartbeat. The lower part of the chart shows the same individual in a state of deep meditation, which also means deep relaxation. And look what happened. The breathing is practically gone. It's a straight line. And what was a disrupted pattern of the heartbeat has turned into a regular sine wave. And looking at this as an engineer, Ben said, this is an effect of harmonization of all the frequencies within the body, and the body is now resonating like a tuned instrument. And he came up with what he called the Kundalini syndrome model. In other words, when this energy in the spine rises, the harmony occurs where the vibration turns into the sine wave at 7 cycles per second, or 7 hertz, as compared to the regular disrupted pattern. And as an engineer, he looked at the body in terms of vibrating systems or oscillators. And in this case, there are 5. The heart aorta system, the brain itself, a cavity in the brain which is filled with fluid, a ventricle, and then the brain itself, the sensory cortex, and then all this results in an electromagnetic field around the head. A system which comes into harmony within itself becomes more powerful than others, and it will entrain, this is another term he used, it will entrain or pull after itself a system that is out of harmony. So once this oscillator or resonating system comes into harmony, it will trigger the rest one after the other. It's a domino effect. So as the heart pumps blood through the aorta, and he called the aorta the biggest plumbing in the body. So it's a tremendous impact on the body, and it shakes the body so that it vibrates. It hits the bifurcation into the legs, and a certain plane wave is reflected up. The next pulse comes down, and the plane wave and the pulse clash, and it creates a disruption in the body. When the harmonious 7 hertz vibration is set up, it seems that the heart and the lungs begin to talk to each other, and they begin to work in harmony, so that a pulse comes down and waits for the reflection to come up, and they both go up together, and then the next pulse comes down, and there is no clash occurring anymore, and the body goes into resonance, triggering the next oscillator, which is the brain. And looking at the head, again, from the point of view of engineering, it's a rigid box resting on a resilient column, which is the spine. What happens is, as the body goes up and down, the skull is vibrated, and the brain, which is a gel-like substance, is floating in a fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid, so that each time the body goes up, it's hitting the skull and then goes down, and so up and down it goes, and it creates a plane wave within the brain. The brain has a characteristic called piezoelectric, which means that when it's stimulated mechanically, it develops an electromagnetic field around it, which is this field right here eventually. So this is the second oscillator, which triggers the third. This is the fluid-filled cavity in the brain called ventricle. And due to this regular vibration of 7 cycles or 7 hertz per second, a standing wave is established in the ventricle, which again creates a very harmonious frequency. And this in turn triggers the sensory cortex. This is a cross-section of the brain, and this is a cross-section of the third ventricle filled with fluid. On top of the third ventricle is a drum-like surface with a bundle of nerve fiber crossing it, which connects the right and left brain hemispheres. And this is very important because as the fluid vibrates harmoniously, it activates this nerve fiber, and it harmonizes the 2 brain hemispheres. And we know that consciousness opens up when the synchronization of the functioning of the 2 hemispheres occurs. And then a certain current is established in the sensory cortex in the lobe of the brain. And as I said before, all this results in an electromagnetic field around the head, so that the head actually becomes an antenna capable of sending out and receiving information which it could not do otherwise. And in that state, higher perceptions become possible. And this was Ben's theory, that through the mechanism of Kundalini and the resonant state of the body, higher perceptions become available. This is an illustration of the sympathetic resonance, how those oscillators trigger each other. If you pluck the strings of this violin, then the strings on this one will resonate without being touched. And this is how the oscillators relate to each other through resonance. And so, as we walk on this planet Earth, which is charged negatively, by the way, we are bathed in a sea of vibrations, of all kinds of electromagnetic fields and all kinds of frequencies, radio and others. And the ionosphere is charged positively, and the potential between the two is constantly fluctuating, so that we are subjected to all sorts of influences all the time. But in that state of resonance at 7 hertz, we plug into the vibration of the earth itself, which is stable, and it happens to be the same 7 cycles per second, so that this biosphere around the Earth resonates at the same frequency, and we get locked into the frequency of the planet itself. And this is why the meditative state is such a relaxing state that some people find it difficult to come out of. Now, having become part of the vibration of the Earth, we then in turn plug into the vibration of the entire solar system, because our Earth here is shown surrounded by all kinds of vibrations as well. There is the magnetopause, magnetosphere, plasma sheet, you name it, trapped radiation. There are acoustical waves, the solar wind coming from the sun, which is also affecting the Earth. So that having tuned into the frequency of the Earth, we in turn tune into the frequency of the entire solar system and the sun, and so on into the cosmos. This is the cosmic connection. As Ben measured these fields around the body, he found that at that frequency of 7 hertz, the field around the body expands the energy that can be measured, and it extends to about 20 inches and tapers off. In a situation where there were hundreds of people meditating at the same time, Ben conducted an experiment because many of these individuals reported hearing inner sounds inside their heads. So when he measured the frequencies of the sounds that they heard, he found that there was one major sound and then other peaks where many people heard certain frequencies. And as he looked at this, and of course this is in kilohertz, as he looked at this, he realized that these other peaks are really the harmonics of the initial sound. In other words, everybody is really hearing one sound, but then it breaks up into harmonics, and some people hear entire chords. It really varies depending on one's evolution. This is how the third ventricle actually looks in the brain, and this is the cross-section of it that we spoke about. And on the brain, there is a narrow band called the sensory cortex. When stimulated mechanically with a needle, for example, during operations, it creates sensations in different parts of the body, and the sensations are laid out in this pattern, and this is called the homunculus, or the little man. And as you notice, the toes are inside the fold of the brain, and then the hip, the hand, and so on. The internal organs are here. So usually the signal goes to the sensory cortex and back to the motor system, telling the body what to do, how to react to the stimulus. But what happens in the Kundalini process, that this circuit becomes activated, and one begins to experience certain parts of the body spontaneously without them being actually stimulated physically. So one doesn't really know, is it happening in the brain or is it happening on the physical level? So eventually, as this current, and he really called it not a current, but an alignment of neurons due to the stimulation of the fiber here, the nerve fiber across the brain, this alignment eventually becomes a permanent situation, so that one's range of perceptions is tremendously expanded. And another thing that happens is that this current or alignment goes also through the pleasure centers, so that actually a person in this state is in a state of bliss, and a yogi sitting in a cave in Himalayas is actually having a lot of fun. So nobody's forcing them to sit for days on end cross-legged. And as Ben said, you can speed up the process of evolution, but we're all on this conveyor belt, and nature is carrying us along, and we will get there anyway, from humanhood to godhood, whether we like it or not. So eventually, as this current continues, starts at the toe and goes up around the body, and it opens up certain energy centers in the body known as chakras. And eventually the current begins to go round and round, and its function is to clear the body of stress so that it can actually perceive higher realities. And if there is a blockage anywhere, it will keep pushing through that until it's cleared so that it can actually go further. And some people can experience great discomfort because of that and not understanding what the mechanism is. And Ben wanted actually to inform the medical community, particularly the psychiatric community, about the phenomenon so that certain symptoms would not be misdiagnosed sometimes as they are as schizophrenia or actually some physical illness, which it is not. Certainly, this mechanism and this phenomenon was known in antiquity, and this pharaoh is saying, my status symbol is this, that my kundalini has risen to the center in the forehead. And in this painting, it's being said, again, it's all coded in these graphic patterns. This is saying, my kundalini has reached this level and has gone even beyond the pharaohs. So this knowledge really was quite universal. Now we will continue, and we will look at the way Ben looked at reality. Because what is it that gives us our reality? And it was described in his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, on the Mechanics of Consciousness. And I will talk later why he used the pendulum as the symbol of what he was talking about. We are dealing with two realities. One is this physical, solid reality that we get blue and black marks from, as he said, when we bump into it. But the information about it is given us by our senses. So that is our subjective reality. And so the two really are giving us the totality of our environment. So what is the objective physical reality? And let us look at the atom. If we magnify the atom and zero in on the electron, and now we think now we will get the answer to what physical matter is. But if we analyze the electron, all we find is an oscillating electromagnetic field. There's no physical matter as such. So we think, well, maybe the nucleus will give us the answer. And we zero in on the nucleus, and we find that it too is only an electromagnetic oscillating field in the void, because between the nucleus and the electron and outside of them, there is nothing but void, the same void that fills in the interstellar space. And the ratio of the distance between the nucleus and the electron would be analogous to a head of a pin in the middle of this room and something rotating around it 30 feet away. And the rest is void. So what is physical matter? Ben drew an analogy between the electron and the pendulum by looking at the cross-section, as it were, of the atom and comparing it to reciprocal motion. In other words, we see the electron now on this side, now on the other side of the nucleus, which would be the pendulum motion. So what happens in the pendulum? It stops, it moves, stops, and moves again. In other words, it's action and rest, action and rest. If you took an actual pendulum and would swing it and attach a pin to it, and you would draw a piece of paper under it like this, it would describe a sine wave. Here the pendulum moved and stopped, moved and stopped. And reality really are the spaces between the points of rest. We perceive reality when there is motion. And reality is really nothing but oscillating fields in the void. And the reason I can touch this screen and I don't go through the floor is because my atoms, or the electrons of my atoms, are actually repelling the electrons of the floor. But if I would speed up my vibration, then I could very well go through the floor. So that it's the interaction between the atoms in this reality that gives us the illusion of solid matter. So how do we get information about this solid physical reality? It is through our senses, through the subjective reality. So let's look at that. How does the neuron work? If this is a neuron, and this is the baseline when the neuron is at rest, when it's stimulated by something, and it doesn't care whether it's a loud noise or a bright light, it simply says, ouch, I'm being disturbed. So the more such spikes you have on the baseline, the more intense the stimulus. But somehow through a miracle of our physiology, our brain can construct our reality out of these spikes that simply indicate a stimulation of the nervous system. And we see beautiful flowers and animals and the sky and so forth. And as we know, our senses are very inadequate. They're very limited and imperfect. Even bees, for example, can perceive ultraviolet light, and dogs can hear the ultrasonic. So that we see reality through our senses only through a very narrow slot. And the rest is really unknown to us. And so we're looking at the physical objective reality, which is oscillating, as we saw, through another system, our subjective reality, through our nervous system, which also perceives it through action, rest, and action, and rest, and action, and rest. So one oscillating system is looking at another oscillating system, and the picture is very blurred indeed. We can extend our realities through instruments, telescopes and microscopes, but in the final analysis, it is only our senses that give us the knowledge. So our subjective reality then is the sum of impressions conveyed by our senses, coded in periods of action and rest, which are oscillating electrical states of the nervous system. And we're constantly comparing one thing to another. Otherwise, we would not perceive reality. For example, if the muscle of the eye is anesthetized, then we do not see anything because the eye needs to scan all the time in order to see something. So, both realities become real due to a change occurring between two states of rest. When there is change, there is motion, and when there is no change and a total state of rest, then reality, as far as we are concerned, disappears because we cannot perceive it. So let's look at the overall picture. Here is the atom, and it can be represented as a sine wave of motion and rest, which is analogous to the motion of the pendulum. Now, let us take a hypothetical situation where we are taking a wavelength, let's say a red photon, which has a very large amplitude. The distances between the points of rest are very far apart. And then we take the same, let's say 1 inch, in other words, the same unit of frequencies, and we speed them up so that within the same length we have many more ups and downs, and let's say it's a violet photon, and then the points of rest get a little closer together, but we get more of them within that span. Then we speed it up even more, let's say the gamma rays or X-rays, and we see that we get even more spikes and or waves, and they get even closer together. Now, let us imagine a hypothetical situation where the speed has become so fast that it's become infinite. At infinite speed, there will be no more oscillation, and the points of rest will in fact overlap, and you would get a straight line. Now, what kind of state would that be? First of all, we see that it's a paradox because the infinite speed now has become total rest. We could probably call it the state of the absolute. It's the source out of which all the frequencies arise. And it will also have the maximum energy. All energy is in it, but it's all in a potential state. And when it begins to vibrate, then it creates all these different frequencies which begin to interact, as we saw before, creating our reality. So one could summarize this by saying the absolute is the point where extremes merge, and a state of rest implies infinite speed. In fact, they become one and the same. And this state, the absolute state, is the substrate for all reality which emerges out of it. In particle physics, there is a principle of uncertainty which was formulated by Heisenberg, and it says, when the momentum or the speed of a particle is known, its position becomes unknowable. The more we know about one, the less we know about the other. Applied to the pendulum, what does it give us? When the pendulum stops before it reverses direction, we do know its speed because it's 0. And then it stops again and we know its speed again. So that means that at those points, its location becomes unknowable. And as Ben said, it can be found anywhere in the universe. That is, it becomes the universe. It fills all creation. It is everywhere. And based on this, he developed much of his further thinking. If this is our solid reality, and like a pendulum, we oscillate and we take off every now and then, and we touch that absolute state of total rest, but it happens so fast that we're not even aware of it, and we come back as if nothing had happened. But suppose we can expand that state and experience it, and in fact we can, then this is what will happen. Here is our reality, and here is the other reality, which we now have expanded. And we can be conscious on that level simultaneously with this level, so that we can actually have the benefit of both. And we can explore that reality and bring back the information. And this is in fact what Ben did. And the information that I will be talking about from now on was received in those states of expanded consciousness. Usually in those states of expanded consciousness, there is a different perception of time. People who come out of those states usually say, time has stopped, or at least it's slowed down. What is happening here? And to put it in some kind of perspective, Ben designed this diagram. This is our time-space, and this is the now moment where they cross, which is going from the past into the future, the eternal now moment. And we can project 1 second on it, 2 seconds on it, and so forth. It's very reliable, and we can measure it, and we can catch trains on time and be to work on time and so forth. However, superimposed on that are 2 other vectors of space-time, which are our subjective space-time. And usually they overlap, and we don't even know the difference. But in altered states of consciousness, there is a deviation. And by altered states, we can mean sleep or meditation or those deep altered states. And the angle of deviation actually determines the depth of that state. And look what happens. If we project 1 second, we see that now in this position of the subjective time, we have 2 seconds for 1 objective second, which means that our time has already doubled. Now visualize a situation where the subjective time tilts more and more and more, where it practically becomes parallel with objective space. And this is what it would look like. Our subjective time is now overlapping objective space. What kind of situation would that be? Well, it would take no time to go anywhere, because you are everywhere at once, because your subjective time has overlapped objective space and it's become infinite. This would be the state of samadhi, the ultimate expansion of consciousness in which your consciousness fills the entire universe. Well, in those states, where does one go? There are many places to go. And again, to put it into some kind of perspective, Ben designed this diagram of the levels of consciousness in creation, because every level, as we saw before, reflects a state of evolution of matter on that level. And there is an indigenous population on all these levels that relates to that level. And our human band is only over here. So he looked at consciousness in its totality. If this vector here represents the quality of consciousness, this one represents the quantity of consciousness, or the capacity of a nervous system to react to stimuli. So here we put the atom, the virus, the plant, and an animal, and finally a human being. So this is where we are in the range of things, and there are many other levels above. And of course, it's all going towards the ultimate state of the absolute that we talked about before, and they're all contained within it. Consciousness is modular. A larger consciousness contains a lesser consciousness. We also see here these curves, and these are called energy exchange curves, and they peak in the middle of each band, which means that the interaction with the environment here is the highest. And I find myself, and you find yourselves, in this physical reality because our energy exchange curve is highest in this level. However, we can also interact with the neighboring realities, but as you can see, the curve here tapers off so that we're not interacting as clearly and as well in those other realities, but still we do. And our nervous system is capable of spanning all these levels, except that we seem to be tuned only to this physical reality. And like a radio set, we can receive all the others, but we keep listening to this one. But it's up to us to tune into all the others as well. Now, the reality below us is the animal, plant, mineral. Those are the realities that Castaneda talks about, for example, in his books, the interaction with those realms. And the upper part is interacting with the next level to the human band, which is the so-called emotional level or astral. There are different names for these levels, and it doesn't really matter as long as we know what it means. And the next level is the mental, then the intuitive or causal, and so forth. There are certain characteristics about these levels, and we interact with all of them, and we can function in all of them. The one next to us is the emotional level, and this is where we go in sleep. As Ben said, this is a preview of coming attractions, because when we die, this is where we go, and we all interact on this level. The next level is the mental level, and emotions, in fact, are not allowed there, so that before you can cross the boundary, it's almost as if there is a customs official who says, any emotions to declare, and down you go if you can't release emotions that are negative. Actually, the emotions such as fear or anger. However, love, which sometimes is perceived as an emotion, is what Ben called is the glue of the universe. And without it, in fact, you can't even go higher. So when you abandon those emotions, you can enter the mental level, and here your reality is what you think. It is also so on our level, but to a lesser degree. But here you're actually creating your reality by what you think. The next level is the intuitive level, and this is where we all interact, and people of creative professions particularly visit those areas, and on that level they pick up a lot of information and they bring it down. The creative aha moment of discovery, for example, of an inventor or an artist, when suddenly a solution comes or an image comes, is in fact something that one perceived on this intuitive level. And as you saw before, our time expands on higher levels. So there was an enormous amount of time here to study the entire situation and then to bring it down. But when you bring it down, it appears like a flash, the aha moment, whereas in fact you spent a lot of time there getting ready for it.